Master these settings for quicker real estate shoots and more money in your pocket. Today we're going to go over how to set up the Nikon Z8 for real estate. I use the shooting banks on this guy. If you have a Nikon Z7 or Z6, they're going to be called user settings. And if you have a Sony or a Canon, they're going to either be called memory recall settings, recall, something along those lines. But setting these up is a very, very efficient way to shoot real estate. It allows you to go from shooting interiors to shooting flash to shooting exteriors with the flick of a button, and all of your settings are going to be right where you need them to be. Now they are going to function a little bit different. Today we're going to focus on the Z8. I usually use my Z7 for my real estate photos, and I set this guy up for video. The only reason that is because this guy can shoot so many different file types and can shoot such better video than the Z7 can, that this is just easier to have this guy for video and keep the Z7 out for the real estate, but they all work relatively the same way. So I'm gonna go through all the different settings on the Z8 for you. If you would like a separate video on the Z7, I can show you how to do that, but I will go over what they're called and kind of the different things and tips and tricks you need, and they should be fairly similar. All right guys, so the first thing you're gonna wanna do, turn on your camera, make sure that you are set up in your scenes, and we're gonna go enable those. Our shooting bank is going to be under the photo menu. Right at the top there, make sure we are in shooting menu bank A. As from now on, I'm gonna call them shooting banks, and we're gonna turn on those extended menu bank because you're gonna need those. Once we're there, let's go back out to our live screen. We are gonna set up our shutter speed at 1/500th of a second, aperture at f8, and set your ISO to anywhere from 64, 100, or sometimes up to 200 to 400. If it's exterior, I typically leave it as low as possible. If it's gonna be cloudy out, I'll adjust that, obviously, because you want a really fast shutter speed so that you can freeze that motion. But usually the lowest ISO is better because those shadows stay really nice and clean. Now let's go back in, and we are going to go to the storage folder and make sure that that folder is set to whatever you'd like it. I keep it at 100. Sometimes people have their own naming schemes, but I keep it at that. We're also going to go to the file naming, and we are going to make sure that that file naming is set up to EXT for exterior. I like to set this up because then I know when I'm in each shooting bank what I'm shooting. So when I'm editing these things, I don't actually have to look at the photos. I can just see the file name and I can easily say, okay, EXT is going to be exterior, INT will be interior, FLS or FLH, whatever you want to call it, flash is going to be my flash photos. That way I don't even have to see a preview. I know what they are, I know where they are, and what they go with. And that is really, really quick on the back end when you're trying to work through a lot of this stuff. So that is going to be our shooting bank A setup. Now, if you're using a Z7 or a Z6, you're going to want to use these in the user settings. They'll be like U1, U2, and U3. You go into the setup menu, the little wrench, and then you save those user settings and you pick which one you want to select. That is a little bit less flexible than the Z8. That's one of the more pro features of the Z8 over a Z7 or Z6, is that this guy is going to remember the setting that you were on, as opposed to the Z7, which is going to just be a preset. And what I mean by that is, say you're shooting an interior and it's a really bright room and you don't need that 1/125th of a second, which we're going to talk about. You adjust it to 1/100th. As soon as you switch out of it and switch back in, you're going to be back at that whatever preset you were, which would be 1/125th for what I like. This guy is going to remember that, so when you switch back to it, it's going to be right at where you left it off, and that makes this guy a lot more flexible when you're shooting an interior. Even exteriors, it just remembers where you last were, and that's, like I said, more of a pro feature of this body. Sony is going to be just like the Nikon's is. I believe Canon is the same way. The one thing about Sony's that I don't like is that they don't allow you to recall the color space or the file naming scheme, so you cannot do interior, exterior, flash. It uses whatever your current file number is, and it does not recall that, and it is extremely frustrating because it is something that is a very simple thing that they could have done, and it's one of the less pro features and one of the things that a lot of people complain about on Sony. I don't know why it's that way, but it just is. And that's why I really prefer Nikon in this regard, is because it is just far more professional and it works far more flexibly for me and how I shoot. All right, the next one we're gonna set up is going to be shooting bank B, which is going to be my interior photos. I like to set up on the Z8 my bank B to be my interiors, and I like C to be my flash. But let's get those interiors done first. So we're gonna swap over to shooting bank B. Once we're in shooting bank B, we're going to adjust our shutter speed to 1/125th of a second, our ISO to 400, and our aperture to f8. I like f8 because f8 gives me the nicest blend. Sometimes you do have to adjust that when you're out on the field, but largely 1/125th of a second, f8, ISO 400 gets me generally right where I need to be. We're usually with just in a few clicks of the dial of where I need to be to fire that off. We're gonna go into our menu now. We're gonna go make sure that storage folder is still 100. And we are also gonna go back into the file naming and change that to INT or interior. Again, this is to make it easier on the back end when I am going through all those files to see which ones are interiors, exteriors, and which ones are flash. Okay, we're gonna set up our final one, which is going to be our flash bank. That is going to be user bank C on the Z8. If you're on a Z6 or a Z7, I like to use manual mode for this. It is a little more flexible and works a little bit more like the Z8 because the settings, they recall to what you last used. For me, it just worked a little bit better using manual mode. I didn't really prefer using it on like the user settings on the Z7 and the Z6 for that. But for this guy, it's gonna work perfectly. It works just like having another shooting bank, just like you are in like manual mode on any of the other cameras. So we're gonna go in, set our aperture to f8. We're going to set our shutter speed to 1/200th of a second because that is our sync speed. And we are going to set our ISO to 160. Now you can adjust this ISO around depending on the lens you have, what you like for your flashes. I have an Godox 8200 Pro, 400 Pro, my bad. And it is quite powerful. So I usually keep it at 160. That's where I like to have that balance so that it does not keep that ambient coming through the windows too much, but it also has a little bit of a boost to give that flash a little bit more power. Now, when we go in here, we're gonna go to that same file naming and we're going to change that to FLS and make sure that storage folder is in that 100. You can change that storage folder. That's why I tell you to always make sure it's on the right one because you could end up having a bunch of different folders. Now, if you like that, you could have your interiors go to one folder, your exteriors go to another, and your flash go to another. That way you have them all broken out. But for me, naming the files int, ext, and flash or flush or whatever you wanna call it, it makes it a lot easier. And that makes it just easier to have them all in one to see them because at the end of the day, that's how I like to delineate my photos and it's what speeds me up. So I don't have to look at the previews, see them, go into Lightroom, do whatever. I can just break it all down by the file names. And that is largely going to be it. Some of the things you do need to know about the Z8, and the Z7, Z6, they will not retain their like high-speed shooting, timer, single shots, things like that. You will need to change that between them. But I use a timer, 2-second timer for everything that I do in my interiors. So I just keep that 2-second timer on, switch between the two of them. It never turns it off. Then I do my exteriors and I switch to high-speed continuous. High-speed continuous is what I like to shoot outside because it just freezes motion and is the best, most flexible option for me. Like I said, it doesn't retain those. The problem that I have had with the Z7 and Z6 is if you power it off or it goes into standby, you do need to change it from single shot to your timer again, and that can catch you off guard, so something to pay attention to. This guy does not seem to have that problem, so again, something that is included on a more professional camera as opposed to a more prosumer camera, which is really nice. And that's largely going to be how you set up your banks. Like I said, Sony's are going to have a memory recall. They're going to be far less flexible than these guys are in terms of file naming. One thing that they do is that I found on the Sony's, is that you can set it up to where it will recall the color space, which I may have said earlier it doesn't do, but it does recall the color space, so RGB or sRGB. Now that does not matter for RAW since we're shooting RAW photos, but what it does is it puts a little underscore in front of the file name if it is sRGB, and if it's Adobe, it just has the first letter of whatever it's recalling the file name as. And that makes it easier to tell what your flash is, so I was able to usually use my flash as sRGB, and then set everything else to Adobe RGB. Again, that does not matter for RAW photos, that is only for JPEGs, but it does adjust the file name, which was something that I noticed it did. So I was able to basically break out my flashes because they all started with an underscore and everything else was whatever, and I had to go in and actually look at the previews, which did slow me down quite a bit. But that should be it. If you guys have any other questions about how to set up your shooting banks, how I shoot any of my photos, how I do any of my timers, why I do it, all the equipment I use, just let me know. This is a really easy way to speed you up because when I first started doing this, I found that constantly adjusting everything in manual mode just takes time. And it kind of goes to the same thing as editing, right? The more that you have to do, the more time it adds per photo, and the more you're sitting there, the more you're editing, and it just adds up. And so the faster you can be in the field, the faster you can be on your computer when you're editing, the better it makes, the better it makes you, the more money that you can make, and the less time you spend doing it, because I'm all about not burning out doing this. That was something that when I worked for a lot of these bigger companies who do this and you know, try to get you to do 6, 7 shoots a day, it just burns you out and you don't want to do it anymore. And there is a way to strike a balance, and there is a lot of things you can do to set your camera up to be faster, to be more efficient, to be better at it. And that's kind of our whole goal here. We are just trying to be better at what we do and be more efficient at it. So if you guys like this video, give me a like, drop me some comments, give me a subscribe. There's gonna be a lot more. And like I said, if you guys have any other things you'd like to see, just let me know. We'll go from there. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it.